Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story. I've called it simply Massacre, and it involves a massacre of a single company of Otago Infantry. In the grand scheme of things in World War One, a single company getting massacred might not seem such a big deal, but, well, it meant a lot to the 160, 180 odd men who had to suffer this. The subtitle is called How Grandad Got Shot in the Shoulder, and that's the reason why I came to investigate this story. So we'll start with the sections of my grandfather's military file that got me interested in this event. So first off, we have this with a bunch of cursive, but I've made it easy for you. So it's been recorded in London, but it's referring to events in France. So it says, wounded right shoulder, D/W, admitted hospital, 14th of July, 1916. And then it says he'd been admitted to the 30th General Hospital in Calais, France, with a GSW. That's a gunshot wound. Any bullet, any shrapnel, anything like that would get classified as a GSW. Shoulder, seriously ill. It's not just a flesh wound. And then in 30th General Hospital, Calais, still with the GSW, right shoulder out of danger. So it looks like it took a fairly large amount of time for him to get, well, to be listed no longer critical or no longer in danger. So this must have been a pretty serious wound. And while it's not included in the files I'm going to show you, it did take him a year to recover and be ready to be put back into action. So I think that's already enough to tell us this was a serious shoulder wound. Now, I have not been able to work out what that D/W on the top line stands for. When I looked it up, it seemed to indicate that DW normally means died of wounds. Well, clearly my grandfather didn't die. If he had, I wouldn't be here recording this right now. There's another form, a casualty form, that gives us a little more detail. So, number 2 New Zealand Field Ambulance, admitted to and transferred to number 2 CCS. That's the Casualty Clearing Station in the field, 14th of July 1916. Y1780, that's just an Army form number. GSW, right shoulder. So a CCS, to let you know basically how it'll go, you'll have an advanced dressing station, and from there they would take them back to the casualty clearing station where they would, well, it's effectively the first hospital they'll get to. From there they'll usually be transferred to a hospital in northern France, and if required, put on a hospital ship and sent across to England. Then we have, again, the same detail, number 30 General Hospital in Calais, and again the notation he was seriously ill. And again the fact that he was now transferred to England. And this wound all occurred on the 14th of July, and it was 12 days later that he was sent across to England. Now, I haven't put the main picture up for this slide yet because I need to warn you if you're squeamish. First, I want to tell you, it's not real. The blood you're going to see is not real blood. It's not a real person's shoulder, but it's that disgusting that I thought I better give advance warning before I put it up. In fact, I found it from this website, selling products for Medic FX, and this is what it says. This full silicon super realistic training shoulder is designed for first aid and military training to practice wound packing. This model is customizable to your specific needs. It is a freestanding table model with embedded blood lines that can be operated separately per wound or simultaneously by connecting the lines. So it's for training. But, excuse me, as it says, it is hyper-realistic, and this is what a serious shoulder wound could actually look like. We're not talking about your Hollywood stuff where you just take a bullet in the shoulder and 5 minutes later you're doing kung fu again. That's the kind of thing you see in so many movies. It's not realistic. A serious shoulder wound that takes you out for over a year. Now, I mentioned in a previous episode, my one about scandal at the top, that this ship, the Rosaura, which was a luxury yacht between the wars, where Prince Edward and Wallace Simpson, the American divorcee, had been on a cruise together and fallen in love and thereby rocked the English monarchy, and I commented that this was a brief crossover to my grandfather's story. Well, this is where the crossover occurs, because during the war, she was in fact a hospital ship, and this was the ship that was used to evacuate my grandfather to a hospital in London after his shoulder wound. and it was called the Dieppe. Now, to give you some context of where we're talking about, this was occurring near Armentières. So the map on the right gives you a pretty good indication of where it is, further north than the Somme and very close to the border between France and Belgium, right smack in the middle of Flanders. And you can see on the map on the left, Armentières was a major crossroads right next to the front line. That purple line you see running through there is where the front line was at this time, and most of the events we're talking about happen a little bit north of that railway line you can see running through there, so almost directly due east from the town of Armentières. It was considered a quiet sector because, again, if you go back to another previous episode, the one which tells you how the New Zealanders were transferred from Egypt to France, you'll know that this was April that they were sent across. And so they wanted to send these guys who might be combat experienced at Gallipoli, but they were not used to conditions in France. They wanted to send them to a quiet sector to get used to things before sending them to a more violent sector of the front, shall we say. Now, I'm going to start with quite a lot of quoting from one particular official history. It is the official history of the Otago Regiment, New Zealand Expeditionary Force. And, well, you'll see soon enough why, in particular, I'm focusing on the Otagos. These are all quotes from the book. The line at Armentières was at this stage typical of other sectors in France, where the merely normal conditions of trench-to-trench warfare prevailed, its selection for the New Zealand Division being doubtless prompted by the belief that it was a suitable area in which to dispose troops as yet unaccustomed to conditions on the Western Front. But the policy of observing what might be termed a passive resistance was of brief duration, and while the sector could hardly compare with the furious and unceasing conflict on some of the areas subsequently held, its pacific reputation quickly disappeared with the introduction of colonial aggressiveness. This drab breastwork of mud, most of it contained in sandbags, extended into the dreary distance north and south, while out to the front, belts of barbed wire, broken and irregular from shell fire, ran parallel to it. Across the waste of no man's land, there was a corresponding system of defences with the vital difference that it belonged to the enemy. And secretly and vigilantly, day and night without cessation, each side moved and watched from the shelter of these sinuous ditches and mud walls and the almost interminable communications which led to them from the outer world. At night, men moved out to erect more wire, or to wander round no man's land, either for the purpose of stalking the enemy who had ventured abroad, or for prying unobserved on his movements. The enemy was heard rather than seen, and thus in time the sense of hearing became more acute than that of seeing. By night, hordes of rats, fat and loathsome looking, wandered defiantly over the parapet or duck walk, devoured all uncovered food, and with their foul bodies pestered those of the garrison who endeavoured to find rest and sleep. I rather like the official history of the Otago Regiment. First off, because the author Byrne obviously fancied himself a bit of a literary artist with lots of rhetorical flourishes, but also he's not holding back, he's not dressing it up, he's perfectly happy to tell you just how disgusting the whole thing was. And he was mentioning about the trenches at Armentières being mostly sandbags and things like this. Well, imagine this at night with rats crawling all over it, and then you've got a pretty good picture of what we're talking about. About this time, approximately May 21st, a message attached to a German rifle grenade was fired over the New Zealand lines, worded as follows: "Send over the time, please, N.Z.E.F." It was perhaps more than a coincidence that the Daylight Saving Bill had just come into operation in the United Kingdom, and it was also significant that the enemy was well aware of the identity of the troops who were occupying the trenches opposite to him. This was the forerunner of other messages, which were delivered or posted up from time to time from either side, some of them grim, some of them humorous. The question of raids was now in June beginning to receive serious attention by division. The object of a raid, it might be explained, was in almost all instances primarily to gain information as to the enemy's identity and possible intentions, and secondly, to embarrass and harass him. To fight and deal with an enemy successfully, even in trench-to-trench warfare, it was essential to know something about him, who he was, his strength and his temper, his dispositions, and his probable intentions and attitudes towards the troops who confronted him. I've actually seen some German documents where they list all of the divisions and how aggressive they're likely to be and what quality of soldiers. The New Zealanders, probably not surprising, were rated as aggressive first-class soldiers, and so were the Australians for that matter, rated much more highly than your average English division. Much of this task of measuring was effected through the agency of patrols and organised observation, but not all of it. Thus a raid, if successful, brought back prisoners who were identified as to their regiment, a useful guide to the fighting worth of the enemy division, and a contribution to determining the general disposition of his forces. To gain the desired information, prisoners were interrogated, and by the adoption of various means persuaded to converse, while documents and other material seized by the raiding party frequently afforded valuable information. The force committed to an enterprise of this kind approached the enemy's lines in silence, or more often under the protective cover of an artillery barrage which forced the opposite garrison to rush for cover, entering his trenches, seized what prisoners were alive after the bombardment, collected maps and documents from dugouts, and then made speedily back to its own lines and safety. At the same time, patrols were constantly out during the night, and brushes and encounters with the enemy, some rather vague as to the results, were becoming frequent. In keeping with the avowed policy of aggressiveness, it was determined that a mastery of no man's land should be obtained. The enemy was apparently imbued with the same offensive spirit, and there was always the possibility of something of interest developing when a patrol from our side crept across no man's land under cover of darkness. On the night of June 13th, a party from the 14th Company under Corporal W. White had just established itself in front as cover to a wiring party when it was assailed at close range by a shower of bombs. You've got to remember that bombs means grenades in most World War I writing. Wiring operations had been in progress for some nights previously, and the enemy, apparently aware of this fact, had decided on a scheme of interruption. A brief skirmish in the dark followed the surprise attack, and the outcome was that some of our men were wounded, and one of the enemy, a Saxon, belonging to the 133rd Regiment, was captured and brought into our lines by Corporal White. A single prisoner would in later days have been regarded as a modest haul, but more curiously and more interest were exhibited in this bewildered Saxon than the fellow regarded himself entitled to. But he was the first German prisoner captured in France by the New Zealand Division, and as such was evidently entitled to be treated with care and affection. Now, I always like to see if I can find out what's going on from the German point of view, and I bought this book, Fighting the Kaiser's War, The Saxons in Flanders, 1914 and 1918, and while it was a rather interesting book, I was disappointed that it didn't really give me that much information about their contact with the New Zealanders, but it did have this section referring to the events just described. In a bombing skirmish with Infantry Regiment 133 on 13th of June, the newly arrived New Zealand Division took their first German prisoner, possibly Soldat Karl Scheer. In July, trench raids grew more frequent. Most of the British raids failed, with bombers ambushing the raiders in or in front of a pre-evacuated front line. The New Zealanders were more successful. Back to the Otago history. On the night of June 16th, a special party of 5 officers and 83 other ranks drawn from the different battalions of the 2nd Infantry Brigade carried out a raid against that portion of the enemy's line known as the Breakwater. The assaulting parties were under the command of Captain Alley of the 2nd Battalion of Otago. The particular point selected for the raid was part of the new enemy work opposite Edmead's farm, and east of Huplin, extending over an approximate distance of 250 yards, with the addition of a portion of the main trench on either side. The raiding troops were divided into wire cutting and left and right bombing parties and telephone party. The particular duties of each party had been carefully rehearsed. A special course of training had been undergone in the arts of close fighting, and a careful study made of the ground. The weapons carried included rifles and bayonets, revolvers, grenades, and knobberries, and electric torches and wire cutters were included in the equipment. Knobberries are basically medieval maces, as seen in the pictures on the right. Whether with the intention of increasing the terror of the enemy or of assisting to lessen the chances of discovery, all ranks had their hands and faces blackened, while the wearing of a white armlet served to distinguish friend from foe once the enemy's trenches were gained. The assaulting parties, according to programme, moved out from the sally port into no man's land and lay down 120 yards in advance of our parapet, waiting for the artillery bombardment to commence. The bombardment, with the medium and light trench mortars cooperating, proved most effective, smashing the enemy's wire and silencing machine guns which opened up from either flank. At the same time, a bombardment of the mushroom was carried out by way of diversion. As the bombardment lifted, the raiders breached the wire ahead without difficulty and quickly entered the enemy's trenches. 2 Germans were bayoneted by the left party, and others were found dead, but a stout barrier of sandbags and wire prevented any lengthy incursion to the right. The party now withdrew as arranged and returned to the safety of our lines. Our total casualties were 2 killed and 8 wounded, and included Captain Alley, who, to the regret of all ranks, succumbed to his wounds. No prisoners were secured as a result of the raid, but it was evident that the enemy was not holding the breakwater in any strength, perhaps for the very good reason that this new work had not reached a stage of completion. Those who took part in the raid were congratulated by Brigadier General W.G. Brathwaite, commanding the 2nd Infantry Brigade, for the fine offensive spirit displayed. You may remember that I mentioned briefly Brathwaite because he was aboard the Maunganui that took my grandfather to war in 1914, and Tahu Rhodes, the ADC to General Godley, happened to comment that his nickname among the junior officers was Old Grumpy. Okay, back to the quote. Referring to the death of Captain Alley, Brathwaite stated that it was to this officer's leadership and example that the enterprise owed its success, and had he been spared, he was convinced that the raid would have been even more successful than it was. It was when approaching the enemy's lines that Captain Alley was mortally wounded, and it was at the same stage that practically all our casualties were incurred. Now, just pause for a moment here. By what measure could you call that a success? A New Zealand officer was killed, along with some other men killed and wounded. They failed to take any prisoners. And there's something else that you should note here. The tactics seem pretty good, but you can't assume that your enemy is stupid, and if you keep repeating the same or similar tactics, well, pretty soon they are going to devise countermeasures. And that is exactly what's going to lead to the near total destruction of one of Otago's companies. Oh yeah, and here's some more pictures of the trench raiding equipment. You can see the wire cutters over on the left, and you can see these knob carries, or, well, let's just call them maces, shall we, when World War I devolved into medieval warfare. In accordance with the promulgated policy of aggressiveness and general scheme of raiding, it was decided that the 4th Otago Company would, on the night of July 13th, carry out a raid against the enemy's trenches. The objects of the raid were to obtain information, to harass and mystify the enemy, and to inflict as much harm upon him as possible. The personnel of the raiding party, all told, comprised 6 officers and 175 other ranks. This number including the assaulting parties, parapet and flanking parties, and the other details of raiding organisation, the whole under the command of Captain W.D. Jolly. Under the pre-arranged plan, scouts and parapet party were to move out from the sally port 45 minutes before 0 hour, and the flanking parties 15 minutes before that time, and take up their positions in shell holes with the object of protecting the flanks in the event of a counter-raid. The scouts were then to return and lead out the remainder of the raiding party to a concealed position in front of and distant 150 yards from the line to be assaulted. Our artillery was to open with a slow rate of fire 10 minutes before zero, at which moment artillery and trench mortars were to open with full intensity over the enemy's trenches and wire entanglements. 20 minutes later, the trench mortars were to direct their fire against the flanking trenches, while that of the artillery was to be lifted, thereby forming a semicircular barrage round the area to be assaulted. Scouts and parapet party were then to rush forward, the scouts' duty being to ascertain the condition of the wire, return and lead the raiders through the gaps. The parapet party was to cross the enemy's trench and bomb suspected shelters in rear, while the assaulting parties were to work along the trench itself in 4 different sections. Meantime, the 2 flanking parties, facing half right and half left respectively, were to guard the flanks from our side of the enemy's wire, while special detachments were to watch the flanks from inside the wire. Well, I can tell you right up front, this plan is not going to survive contact with the enemy. And this brings us to a sergeant who was leading one of the sections that was guarding the left flank of the assault. So he was out in no man's land, as described in the previous passage, but he wasn't in the section that was directly assaulting. He was a veteran of Gallipoli. He started out as a private. He was a sergeant by now. He ultimately rose to be a junior officer until he was badly wounded on the Somme, and that was the end of his World War I. He was a very smart fellow and ultimately became a professor of mathematics at Edinburgh University. And his book shows his near photographic memory and his recollection, so much of it just in terms of the names of his friends and people he knew who died and when they died and where they died. Some parts of the book are quite depressing. And his descriptions of what happened in this attack are graphic and informative. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he actually had successfully managed to sneak his violin to Gallipoli. It really wasn't allowed, but somehow or other he got away with it. He landed on the beaches and kept it all through the Gallipoli campaign. There's quite a moving passage from December of 1915 where he talks about playing Christmas carols while they're right up near Quinn's Post in a very dangerous position up on the banks of Gallipoli, playing violin music, and it's quite moving. And if you want to go and see a short video about this violin, which still survives, and hear more of the story of Alexander Aitken, you can have a look for this New Zealand On Screen short little episode about Alexander Aitken and his violin. The whole of the 4th Otago Company had been in Armentières, training for a raid of ambitious scope, as may be judged by the number, not much less than 200, of those preparing to go over the top. In retrospect, it appeared ill-considered to have trained so many men in the town. Rumour may have been wrong in believing that Armentières harboured spies, or that the occasional pigeon seen flying eastward over no man's land carried messages to the enemy. But apart from that, those who had to do the raiding could never see the point of the large raid, in which, by the nature of things, we were almost bound to suffer losses quite disproportionate to the damage inflicted on the enemy, to the number of prisoners taken, and to the amount and quality of the information presumed to be gained. Now, this picture here shows the kind of damage that could be done without risking men in no man's land. These are actually some of the New Zealand frontline trenches at Armentières after a massive German artillery assault, and you can see the trenches and the dugouts have been completely smashed. The photo didn't actually specify which particular disaster this was, but the Otago history and also the history of the Auckland infantry talks about a time where the Germans absolutely hammered the Auckland lines and they suffered about 150 casualties, and the Germans didn't have to risk anything except firing their big guns. These losses were not due to inefficiency. The men trained for the raid, like those trained for the attacks at the Somme, and did not fail to carry out their orders. Indeed, had they been allowed a small margin for independent judgment, more would have survived. Were raids for pure destruction, then the artillery and mortars could safely be left to do that. Were they for the purpose of identifying the regiments opposite? Then the most efficacious were the silent raids, in which a small party crept across no man's land without advertisement and surprised and captured a few prisoners, as the Maoris, very restive in their pioneer capacity, demonstrated a fortnight later in a raid up towards Plug Street. But these were vain afterthoughts, prompted by the complete disaster of the Otago raid. What's this comment about the Maoris being pioneers? Well, there was a Maori battalion, and they were made pioneers. Pioneers were supposed to mostly do, digging of trenches, laying of barbed wire, and so on. And the Maori troops weren't satisfied to just remain in a role like that, and actually undertook some trench raids themselves, so acting as combat troops, despite their title of so-called pioneers. The night before the raid, the 12th July, was heavy and still, with the brooding feeling, in my mind at least, that a Minenwerfer bombardment might suddenly start on the right. Minenwerfers were the German howitzers. They came in various different calibers. The one on the left is a heavy one held by the Imperial War Museum. At dusk a flute was heard playing in the German trenches. Unfamiliar airs, German folk songs, with the same affected tunes and cadences as occur in Schubert's Morgengruß, from the song cycle Die Schöne Müllerin. This was melting while it lasted, but with true German gallows humour, the unseen flautist, knowing that we must be listening, modulated into a travesty of the Dead March in Saul, bizarre and truly macabre. To me it seemed to say, "For you tomorrow night, Kameraden." The Dead March in Saul is usually played at funerals, and if you watched my episode about the death of Private Gilchrist and the funeral at sea, there was a passing comment there that the Dead March in Saul was played at his funeral. Such musical and other demonstrations from the trenches opposite were not new. There had been a morning in early June when a tremendous tin canning and beating of shell gongs had begun in the north and run south down their lines to end, without doubt, on the Swiss frontier, in celebration of their victory at Jutland or the sinking of the HMS Hampshire with Lord Kitchener on board, or both. And again, if you go back through my old episodes, you'll see I actually made an episode about Hampshire's contribution to the Anzac journey and their convoy across the Indian Ocean, which brought them to Egypt. And now a single bullet seemed to fulfill some part of the flautist's omen. 3 cadets studying for commissions, formerly NCOs in Guards regiments serving in many parts of the front, and latterly at Vimy Ridge, had come up to our sector to do officers' night routine with our own company officers. I had seen them not many minutes before, 2 over 6 feet and 1 not so tall. Just now, after stand down, they were with Captain Hargest, himself of medium height, in the short alley of the trench to company HQ. 4 heads in a straight line. A single bullet killed both tall men, sparing the other 2 by inches only. On the morning of the 13th July I stood too, with the Dead March on the flute and the death of the 2 cadets unpleasantly in the foreground of my mind. This, the day of the Otago raid, was quiet enough, except for intermittent ranging shots by our artillery on the German wire, which seemed a gratuitous piece of advertisement. Now, other accounts say the Germans were doing ranging shots on no man's land. Was it New Zealand and British artillery or Germans? Either way, probably a warning sign that they should not have gone ahead with the raid. They did not pay attention to this warning. The front to be raided was immediately to our right. The companies on the right and left of the sector, ours being on the left, were each to supply a covering party of a platoon or so, who were to go out halfway and were to lie in cover, facing outwards to counter any flanking attack. This was perhaps according to the textbook, but 2 well-placed machine guns would have served as well. Perhaps my prejudice owed something to the fact that I myself, borrowing from Platoon 11, and now a sergeant since 1st July, was one of the NCOs in charge of the covering party, but I felt in any case that the plan showed little imagination. During the afternoon we studied through periscopes the ground where the party had orders to lie, beyond the outermost of our own wire entanglements, to the left of a line of blasted trees, pollarded windows running obliquely across no man's land, a line of trees destined to haunt my dreams in after years. Night came on, even quieter, more brooding, more sinister than the previous night of the flute player. There was very little machine gun fire. I was ready to have passed an oral or written examination on those trees, and where the gaps in our wire lay with respect to them. Besides, this was ground fairly well known to me from wiring parties. After dark the password was given out, chosen with incredible lack of tact and feeling: Cadet. Now this is from Google Maps, and I managed to locate the exact place where the attack happened. Now that drainage ditch right next to the road is actually in the exact location of the New Zealand trench. Now most World War I trenches don't survive anything like that, so I don't know if this is a remnant of World War I or if the farmers just simply built a drainage trench in exactly the place where the New Zealand trench was, but that hole in the ground you see there is exactly where the New Zealand frontline trench was, and the Germans would have been somewhere in the distance, perhaps where that shiny roof you can see in the distance were. That's roughly how far away the Germans were. But of course it didn't look anything like that at the time. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a photo from World War I, so I had to borrow from a different battlefield. This is in fact the Somme from a few months later, but again it gives the right impression. And also, as I walked around using Google Street View, I managed to get across to the left of where the raiders were going out, where Aitken's covering platoon would have been, and that white building to the right is actually part of a campground today. You can actually go and sleep in a tent or a cabin right between the New Zealand and German frontline trenches, right in the middle of no man's land. And we are looking, in this case, in the direction where the New Zealand Otagos were going to be doing their attacking. But Aitken himself was supposed to be facing left, watching the Germans. But again, of course, it didn't look anything like that back then. It's hard to believe, frankly, that that was once no man's land and all that we imagined with it. It doesn't really look like much now, does it? About 10 p.m. we were to be out there, settling in whatever cover could be found. At 10:15 p.m. a casual bombardment, not heavy, was to fall for a while on the sector to be raided, and then gradually die down. A little before 12 midnight a heavier one was to open out, and exactly at 12 midnight the main raiding party was to begin its dash. We crept in silence from one great crater to another until we came to the first of the blasted trees. At its base, as I was well aware, ran a small grass-grown ditch. We crawled down this to the outermost entanglements. By 10:15 p.m. we were all lying out beyond the gap, except for some half-dozen whom Captain Hargest himself, almost as if he had foreseen the event and had decided to save some men at least, took out and placed in a large crater, which they occupied all night, and luckily for them, for though later under great shrapnel and machine gun fire, they were in excellent cover and suffered no casualties. And this Captain Hargest that he mentioned, I like to look up some of these people. Well, Captain Hargest ended his life as a brigadier, killed in the fighting in France following the D-Day invasion in August of 1944. He was 53 years old. He made it all the way through World War I, only to die in combat in the post-D-Day fighting. And there's in fact a school in Invercargill at the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand called the James Hargest College. And they have quite a neat school uniform. The kids overall and the photos on the website actually all looked rather tidy, I thought. And there he is with an awful lot of medals from his various different events. Although, truth be told, he was present in Crete when the Germans attacked Crete, and he frankly made some mistakes that probably helped out the German assault. And given what a touch-and-go thing the battle for Crete was, if a few other things had gone right for the Allies and the New Zealand troops on Crete, the Germans might well have been beaten. So In that sense, yeah, well, we'll just skip over his mistakes at Crete. But fascinatingly, during World War II, in the later campaigns after Crete and North Africa, he was taken prisoner and sent to an Italian prisoner of war camp, and he was one of the few Allied soldiers to ever succeed in escaping from an Italian prisoner of war camp and made it up into Switzerland, and actually wrote a book about his experiences escaping this camp, Farewell Campo 12. So he went all the way through World War I. He at least would survive this particular massacre. And now there's a Minenwerfer shell hole. Beyond the wire, the rest of us faced half left. On making a rapid tour, I felt that Sergeant Bree, a main body man with a very early number, 8/13, on the right had his men too near the trees, which could be a good ranging mark for mortars, and that they were facing so much to the left as to be side on to the enemy, and thus unprotected from the really dangerous quarter. Now this is something else just to note in terms of my grandfather. So my grandfather's service number was also very low, and anybody who would see the service number could instantly tell that they were a main body man. In other words, one of the men who went out in that first fleet who left New Zealand in October of 1914. The service number alone would say, this is a main body man. Everybody else was known by which reinforcements. Were you 3rd reinforcements? Were you 7th reinforcements? Were you 12th reinforcements? But main body men were special. As the first bombardment was due in a minute, I had to return to my end, where my smaller group had occupied an uneven line of shell holes and were deepening these with entrenching tools. Only one man, Alf Hughes, of my old section, was farther to the left. I could have touched him with my rifle. We joined the two craters into a single post and put up head cover with the sandbags we had carried out, disguising these with grass and loose earth. At 10:15 p.m. the first bombardment fell, followed by a lively retaliation, which, for the most part, went overhead. This is pretty normal, by the way. If one side shoots their artillery guns at the other side, it will almost always lead to the enemy artillery firing shells at your lines in retaliation. One reason to stay quiet, frankly. At 11 p.m, the noise died down. The men had dug themselves in and all was quiet except for the desultory crackles of machine gun fire and the faint hiss of the rising very-lights. These are like flare guns, showing diamonds of dew on the grass stems close to our faces. It was now near midnight and cold. For what seemed a long interval, there was complete darkness and silence. The sky above the town behind us was suddenly lit up by dozens of flashes. Shells whined over. There was a series of crashes along the German line to the right, and a tremendous din for a few minutes, though all sense of physical time was lost. At 12 midnight, my luminous wristwatch was a hiatus in the fire, and there was a hiatus in the firing that told me that the main raiding party had begun its dash. But simultaneously scores of flares rose up from the German trenches, spun like Catherine wheels high up into the air, and shook out spangles of light. Evidently, this was a preconcerted signal, for in a moment from front, right and left came the scurry of German shrapnel, pelting down on no man's land, machine guns adding to their streams of bullets in a deadly crossfire. High explosive tore up the ground about us, and trench mortar bombs burst along the line of trees. I wondered how the main raiding party was faring, but was more immediately concerned about the right half of our covering party, which seemed to be under severe bomb and shrapnel fire. I had the impulse to go along, but it was useless, and indeed impossible in such intense fire, to leave our post and to try to give help, the retaliation continuing undiminished for over 2 hours. I do not know how we were spared, for the ground all about was seen in daylight afterwards to be pockmarked with bomb holes. Of the others of the party to the right, only one, MacLeod, was unwounded. There was Hughes also on my left. I reached out across and stirred him. He was dead, and had been so for some hours, lying with rifle and arm at full length in an aiming position. McAvoy and I half walked, half crawled, under slight fire, random and not aimed, to the line of trees, more blasted than ever. There Sergeant Bree and William Robertson were lying, the former grievous to see, even in the half-light, but Robertson without a mark on him and his face calm, even smiling. Death is said to be equal-handed for all. 2 or 3 yards beyond this pair we found Harper lying, his thigh badly fractured, but calm and in full possession of his sense. We asked if it was very bad. He simply said, "I think I'm done for." He spoke quietly, with the same high calm, far beyond his years. He was, I suppose, my own age, 21, perhaps 22, and he knew better than we, for he had lost too much blood to recover, and died of wounds a week later. At this moment I caught sight of a group of men carrying a stretcher with them. It was a volunteer party led by Captain Hargest, always the first to think of his men. These men lay Harper on the stretcher and carried him in. I followed with all the rifles as dawn was breaking. In the trenches we learned the full story of the raid. Now back to the official history of the Otago Regiment. All these duties were made perfectly clear and familiar by practice and training, and nothing was left to chance so far as preparation was concerned, in order to ensure the success of the operation. But alas, through some tragic cause, the whole affair was to prove a ghastly and expensive failure. During the afternoon the enemy had carried out a certain amount of artillery fire, which had all the appearances of a ranging shoot. The misgivings and suspicions aroused in not a few minds by this action were later only too fully confirmed. Every man was in his position in no man's land at the appointed time, and the artillery support was forthcoming as arranged. But no sooner had our barrage lifted and the raiding troops proceeded to move forward than a concentrated and murderous shrapnel and machine gun fire fell like a thunderclap over no man's land, between our front line and the objective. Under this withering and devastating blast, the raiders vainly endeavoured to press forward. The casualties became increasingly heavy. All of the officers were either killed or wounded, and when finally the order came to withdraw, merely a handful of men remained to stagger back to our lines. The whole affair was a tragedy, and though no definite information could of course be obtained on the point, the natural conclusion come to was that the enemy had secured warning of the raid, and the 4th Company walked into a trap only too well prepared. And no text to go with that, but I thought the grimness of that painting really matched it. A couple of stretcher bearers looking so exhausted, carrying a dead or wounded man through the barbed wire. In total, 4 officers and 31 other ranks were killed. 4 officers were wounded, that's all of the officers, and 118 other ranks, and reported missing 6 who were later determined to be German prisoners of war. In total, I think only about a dozen men managed to escape without being wounded or killed. This represented a total loss of 163 of all ranks. The casualty list included the following officers. Killed: Captain W.D. Jolly, Lieutenant L. Millard, Lieutenant T. Gilman, and Second Lieutenant Black, and so on, and so on, and so on. Well, you know by now, if you've watched any of my other episodes, I always like to follow up some of these names, so I thought I'd try and see who exactly was this Captain Jolly who was killed in the attack. And this was William David Jolly. This is gravestone. In fact, if you visit this particular graveyard, there's a rather melancholy line of gravestones, because all of the men from the Otago Company who were killed in the attack are buried in the same place next to each other. You can see he was 45, and I'm sure to these young soldiers of 18, 19, 20 he seemed like an old man, but now that I'm in my 50s, 45 really doesn't seem that old. There's a photo of him, and a few interesting details I got from his military file. He had 6 children, and the youngest was born in 1911, so probably, and very sadly, would never actually remember her poor father. He had been mayor of Cromwell, that's a modest-sized town in the South Island of New Zealand, and there was a big memorial service for him in the town of Cromwell, and they played, in fact, the tune Dead March Saul. And you will recall this story we had a little earlier from Aitken about the German flautist mocking them with it, and it was a pretty common tune to be played at funerals in those days. And one other detail I got while looking him up was one of his children, Douglas, went on to become a rather well-known combat surgeon in the Spanish Civil War, fighting on the side of the anti-fascists. and there is actually a plaque for him in Cromwell. So there's a few interesting little asides. Another one of the officers killed was Lieutenant Leonard Millard, or Millard. I think we'll go with Millard. He was only 24 years old. Doesn't he look rather snappy in that photo on the left? He had survived Gallipoli, as well many of the soldiers engaged in the trenches in 1916 in France were already combat veterans. That it wasn't like they were bringing many green troops to the battlefield. They just had to learn different conditions and a different enemy. And he had a wife back in New Zealand, and he had a child. I guess he left his wife pregnant when he went to war, and, well, as a result of that, never actually got to see his child. Now we get back to the account of Alexander Aitken. What actually happened is not clear, but it was said that Captain Jolly, officer commanding 4th Company, seeing that further advance was suicidal, fired up a rocket, perhaps a green one that I fancied I'd seen among the red ones. That was to have been the signal for return. Some dozen or less managed to scramble back unhurt, but 9/10 of them at least were already hit. Captain Jolly was wounded, but refused to be taken back on a stretcher, saying that there were others much worse off than he. A little later he received a second and fatal wound. Mr. Gilman, though already wounded, went out again with bombs single-handed to silence a machine gun which he had located in no man's land. He also was wounded again, this time mortally, and was brought in from the wire next night. And there is Lieutenant Thomas Gilman. Now, when I was looking up his military file, I also checked out the Auckland War Memorial Museum online cenotaph, which usually has some details and occasionally photos of various New Zealand soldiers. This particular entry, however, had somebody had uploaded a letter that was sent to his brother, one of these, I'm sorry your brother died, let me tell you about it type letters. Unfortunately, I can't give proper credit to it because the museum website does not say who uploaded it. But this was the letter. It was addressed from In the Field, somewhere in France, 3rd of August, 1916. Dear Arthur. It is now nearly 3 weeks since the fatal night of July 13th, and although you will have heard ere this from the Colonel, I should like to pay a tribute to the memory of a very gallant officer. I can't think without bitterness of how your great loss and ours was really avoidable, and that his splendid sacrifice to duty was unnecessary. I mean that my interpretation of his duties as battalion bombing officer does not include going out with raiding parties, especially the patchwork affairs. Again, some of the cursive is quite hard to read, but I think it was the patchwork affairs, which a grossly inept and incompetent general marks a chief factor in his stupid bogey tactics, which were all very well against the Turks, by which we have suffered heavily, and to what purpose and with what result. This godless person is now, we hear, on indefinite leave in England, and I have no compunction in taking refuge behind a green envelope when I say that all ranks are glad of the fact. We have no use, especially at this stage of the war, for chocolate something or other idols. Again, I really couldn't quite make out what that cursive was, but you get the general drift. Now the question here is, who is he talking about? Now first clue, of course, is it has to be a general who was also with the New Zealanders at Gallipoli, and I think that reference to a godless person may well mean that he's actually referring to General Godley. It certainly makes sense that that's who he might be referring to, and I have read elsewhere that Godley was not terribly popular with many of the New Zealand soldiers. I guess it's also a natural reaction to blame those in high command when something goes wrong. Many of the other trench raids went quite well, and it was inevitable that sooner or later they would get caught out, and this fellow certainly wanted to blame the general. Now I tried to double-check that fact about being sent back to England, and there was a note that in maybe June or July, Godley had gone for a couple of weeks' leave to England, but he had returned to France by August. But it may well be that the soldier writing this letter wasn't aware of that fact and thought that him going back to England was this indefinite leave. So if I had to guess, I think he's probably talking about General Godley. And the reference to a green envelope, that's rather interesting. All the soldiers were allowed once a month to send a letter that the censors wouldn't read. I guess if they wanted to write, a love letter to their wife or something like that. Now, they had to commit on their honour that they weren't going to put any information in these letters that, the censors wouldn't normally allow, and they did open a random sample of them, and you were subject to, military court-martial if you were using these green envelopes incorrectly, and otherwise every other letter would be read by the censors. So that's what the reference is to a green envelope. He's using this opportunity to say in private just how much he disapproved of the general tactics and the general himself. Dear Tom was wounded early in the affair. Where, I don't know, but after having his wound dressed, he went back again when he got a piece of shell in the face and several machine gun bullets in body and legs. So we may draw some comfort from the fact that he didn't suffer at all. I hope you'll get his effects safely. I have heard they were given to one of his colleagues for safekeeping before he went out. Fear was an emotion entirely unknown to your brother. His electrical vitality and irrepressible spirits took him into places where nobody else would venture, and when the monotony of the daily routine or the weather threatened to make everyone miserable, it was always his burst of song or a piece of Kipling, whom he loved, that put everybody in good spirits. He had a passion for souvenirs. The last time I saw him alive was on one afternoon when he, Corporal Harper, who was wounded on that night, and myself, brought in several Hun bombs that they had dropped in a hurry on some previous occasion. Your comfort must be the knowledge that he died as I believe he would have wished, at the head of his men. I've spoken to several of them since, and none can do him sufficient honour. In one respect you are fortunate, in having so fine an example, the finest possible, of courage and devotion to follow. Please tender my heartfelt condolences to your people. Sincerely yours, H. Lawson Smith, Corporal. And you can see on the right that that's a copy of the very final page of the letter with that line about please tender my heartfelt condolences. Now, I looked up the military file of this H. Lawson Smith, and it was interesting because it was missing some normal details and normal paperwork that you find in all of the military files. And I suspected this might well be the case, like my grandfather, where there were two separate files for the same man. So I went hunting, and I couldn't find any others for a Lawson Smith, but I found another one for a Henry Dawson Smith. And when I opened it up and searched through it, it was very clear that they'd misread the cursive, and in fact it's the same guy. It's misfiled. It's Henry Lawson Smith, but the New Zealand Government Archives make it look like there's two different soldiers, a Henry Lawson Smith and a Henry Dawson Smith, but they are the same man. And from that, I did pick up one interesting detail, that on August the 3rd, 1916, the day the letter is dated, he was wounded. Not severely wounded, it calls the wound slight, and he was remaining with the unit, not evacuated to hospital. So you can't help imagining that after his minor wound, he had a bit of time away from the front to sit down and write a letter, and so that's how I imagine, at least, how this letter came to be written and sent back to New Zealand. And then one of the other ones who died, George Harry Black. And there he is. He was a lieutenant, and he came from Gisborne. Now, I was born in Gisborne, so I thought when I saw that I wanted to hunt down a few more details. And I discovered this photo, again from the Auckland Online Cenotaph, that there was a plaque for him at the gate entrance to a small little primary school just south of Gisborne. In fact, I looked up this school, Muriwai Primary School, and right now, in the latest statistics, it had a student population of 31 kids across all primary grades. For Americans, a primary school is an elementary school. And there's the front gate, and you can see on the left side and the right side of the driveway in, you can just make out these bronze plaques, and it's a bit hard to read even in the larger one, but the one I've put the red thing around is the name of G.H. Black. And he was a sheep farmer. Well, when you imagine New Zealanders living down there, you certainly imagine sheep farmers, don't you? And he sailed to war on the Maunganui. This was the same ship that carried my grandfather to war, but a different voyage. My grandfather left in October of 1914. Black left in April of 1916, but same ship. And he only arrived in France and was taken on strength to the New Zealand division on June 15th, 1916, which meant when he died, he hadn't even been in action for a whole month. And a couple of other interesting things about that location, since, as I said, I was born there. I left when I was 5 years old, so I only have very basic memories. And I lived, in fact, about halfway between Muriwai School and Gisborne, which you can see on the map. Gisborne's claim to fame is that it is the first city in the world. The first city in the sense that it is just large enough to be a city, the way New Zealand counts them, and when you look at the international date, not the dateline, the what do you call it, the timeline, where the new day starts, there are no other cities closer to the international dateline. So if you go any further east, you end up crossing into, well, effectively yesterday. And a few other things worth noting. Right next to Muriwai School, there's a little piece of land that juts out, and that is called Young Nick's Head. And that is a very important site in New Zealand history, because when Captain Cook was exploring the South Pacific, he offered a reward to any of his crew aboard the Endeavour who would be the first to spot land. And he offered a reward, I think it was quite a lot of rum, if I remember right. And there was a ship's boy aboard. I think he was a surgeon's assistant. He was only 12 years old, and his name was Nicholas Young. And he was the first one to spot land. So he was rewarded with the rum and also to have this piece of land named after him. So it is even today called Young Nick's Head. And there's a statue of young Nick from not far away, or Nicholas Young. And just up the road from Muriwai is a little old wooden church. And there's a plaque from it. This is the oldest church in Poverty Bay and was built in 1866. It was the only building in Matafero spared by Tikuti in 1868. Tikuti was a Maori chieftain who led a raiding party into the area and did enormous damage, but also significant because later in life my father decided to go back and become a minister. He trained as a Presbyterian minister, and his very first parish was the Matafero parish. And in fact, for the first 5 years of my life, we lived in the church manse right beside this historic church. And one more thing to note. Down there is the Mahia Peninsula. Now, I remember it for a childhood holiday away at the beach and getting swamped by this enormous wave, which actually gave me nightmares as a kid. A recurring nightmare about giant waves catching me no matter how far away I ran from the sea. But it's much better known now as the Mahia Peninsula, and right down at the bottom of that southern tip, that is where Rocket Lab has its main launching pad. And well, if you're not familiar with Rocket Lab, sometimes it's called SpaceX's little brother. It's launching smaller rockets up into orbit, but they certainly have ambitions to grow. Now let's carry on with a passage from the official history of the Otago Regiment. The battalion commander was immediately confronted with the formidable task of getting in the many dead and wounded who were lying in no man's land. Every available man was requisitioned for stretcher-bearing purposes, and although everyone worked desperately hard throughout the night, and certainly no one harder and more regardless of danger than Private J.D. Stark, the task had barely been completed when daylight broke and put an end to operations. Further bearer parties were out on the following night over the track of the ill-fated raid, and 1 wounded man and 17 bodies were recovered. It was on the occasion of this renewal of the search that Second Lieutenant A.G. Brockett was killed. And then we have a passage from another book, one I haven't cited before, The Silent Division. I believe it was actually called this because the New Zealanders were kind of known for being unusually quiet when they charged the enemy. Like the Australians were known for charging, yeah! The New Zealanders apparently tended to just be rather silent and serious when they went about a charge. And here's what it said. On the night of 13th to 14th July, 2nd Otago attempted to raid at Pont Bellot. They assembled in no man's land before the barrage opened, faces blackened, lightly armed with rifle and bayonet or Knobkirrian bomb, and with all their identification marks removed. But the very instant that our barrage fire opened, no man's land was swept by a tremendous concentration of shrapnel and machine gun fire. The Otagos endeavoured to press on and indeed reach the enemy wire, but by this time the majority were down, and there was nothing for the survivors to do but fall back with their wounded. The front line was now under a terrible fire. The air was full of German flares bursting over no man's land, and yet men went back time and time again until all the wounded were in. Of the raiding company, a handful only were unhit. And there is one of these frontline aid stations. Men brought back would have been patched up as best they could and then sent back to the casualty clearing station. This particular one is from near Passchendaele in 1917, but I imagine the ones near Armentières would have looked quite similar. And then I've quoted Herbert Hart before. He was the one I quoted talking about how the order to evacuate Gallipoli was given and how sad and angry all the men were and how reluctant they were to leave. Herbert Hart in the photo is the man on the horse to the right in the photo, the one right in the middle. And here's what he had to write, because he was there quite close to events. 13th July 1916. 1st Otago Battalion raid at midnight. I spent from 8 to 10 p.m. with Colonel Charters, attending to final details before the raid, arranging to give him support, working parties and stretcher bearers if required. His men were then nearly ready, armed to the teeth with revolvers, knives, knobkerries, rifles, sharpened bayonets, bombs and a few rifles. Their faces were blackened, white identification cloth was positioned on each arm and on each man's coat at the back. All were keen. In higher circles there was a feeling of suspense, and it had been observed during the afternoon the enemy had been ranging with his own guns on his own front trenches, his barbed wire and no man's land. So maybe they should have taken the warning and cancelled the trench raid, you think? Anyway, punctually at midnight our trench mortars and artillery commenced the bombardment. By this time the raiders were lying out in no man's land, one full company, 180 men. I was in my war station near the phone to receive messages and issue orders. We sat and watched the clock, with code list ready to decipher messages. The bombardment continued fiercely. The shells were bursting everywhere, but were highly concentrated by both sides at the raiding sector. The sky was illuminated by flares, red rocket signals, and bursting shells and bombs. The time when the bombardment would normally have ceased passed by, but no message arrived announcing the return of the party, and the tumult still continued. We knew then that all was not well. Another half hour of suspense, and then our artillery ceased fire. 15 minutes later the enemy quietened down also. Then the information began to filter through slowly, and it was gradually learnt what had taken place. It appears that the enemy opened fire on no man's land with shrapnel and machine guns immediately our bombardment commenced. He would not have seen our men, but guessed they were intending to raid. The result to the party was appalling. They tried to advance but were mown down, and not one man reached the enemy trenches. It takes a long time for information to become available in a bad smash, as the leaders are nearly always unavailable, being killed, wounded or missing. In this exact case, exact and correct details were not available until next night, but it was early reported that about 80% of the men and officers were casualties. We sent over all our stretcher bearers. Canterbury did likewise, and also the field ambulance and the SAPs were soon filled with bleeding, groaning men. Our medical officer was sent across also. Charters' men tried to get in the killed and wounded from no man's land. This was not completed by daylight. Next night parties went out and recovered most of them. Lieutenant Brockett was killed while in command of the party bringing in the dead the night after the raid. And there is Archibald Geoffrey Brockett, who died in the recovery operations. And he had actually taken part in New Zealand's very first military action of World War I. Samoa was at the time German Samoa, and with the assistance of the Australian Navy, 2 troop ships were sent out from New Zealand to take possession of German Samoa. And he was one of the men aboard those vessels. He was in fact discharged as medically unfit because of a bad case of pneumonia. When he got back to New Zealand and recovered, he chose to re-enlist, was given an entirely new service number, and went out again. But as you can see, he didn't last that long. The Samoan expedition is in fact why the Maunganui, who was the flag transport that was taking my grandfather out, was numbered number 3, N.Z.E.F, His Majesty's New Zealand Transport 3, because the 2 ships that went out to Samoa were numbers 1 and 2. And that's why the first one to go out, leading the main body fleet, was given the number 3. Now we have one more personal account, the Memoirs of William Anderson. He was a stretcher bearer, and in fact this photo on the top left does show some stretcher bearers at Armentières. So for all I can tell, there was no name on the photo, one of those men might even be William Anderson or some of the other men he mentions. When the day arrived, Jack Egan came along to our dugout asking if anyone would volunteer to make up another squad to augment the strength of the fourth bearers who were involved in the raid. Alex Bulling and I offered to make up the number. In the afternoon we went down to the subsidiary line where the raiders were assembled. Raiders had their faces and backs of their hands blackened to render them less visible when flares were sent up. My schoolmate from my first day at school blackened my face for me with charred cork. He was in the battalion transport, its lines being nearby. During the shelling, one of our shells fell short and killed one chap, Banks, and wounded another. Following the customed way of going out about a raid, we went out into no man's land and lay down until our artillery opened up on the trenches to be raided, and continued for a precise time when the raiders would be ready to pounce on their quarry. And it occurs to me that choosing a precise time of exactly midnight was again kind of stupid, easy to predict by the enemy. Let's carry on. By immediately charging in when the barrage lifted, little time was given to emerge from dugouts and put up resistance. It was inevitable that Fritz would discover this method of night raiding, and it was our ill luck that we were the ones upon whom he applied his countermeasures. Immediately our guns opened up, theirs replied, showing that the raid was expected. Instead of replying by shelling our front line as formerly, they directed them to no man's land, where we were lying exposed to all the stuff they had to deliver. We all knew, of course, that it was all up a tree with the raid, and the sensible thing to do was to wriggle our way back to the lines. This obviously sensible thing to do in other circumstances did not apply here. If prior to the raid it had been considered likely that our position would be shelled, and instructions had been given that in such case we should independently retire, then that direction would have been acted upon. Until authoritatively cancelled, the raid was still on, and there we were, as surely fixed to where we lay as if pegged to the ground. Disengagement or retreat in such a hopeless situation is unthinkable. And there's some more Armentières stretcher bearers. And a few more. I think these ones were at the Somme, in fact, but all New Zealanders. After it seemed an eternity had passed, there was a break in the shelling, and I got out of the shell hole again and put a wounded man nearby on the stretcher. No sooner had I done so than it resumed as before. I instinctively flattened out, and my patient a few inches higher, feeling exposed, called to me to not leave him there. I up and hauled him off the stretcher and into the shell hole, where we kept company until the shelling again stopped, this time for good. I found the iron stretching arms of the stretcher at one end were broken, but with no helper in sight, it was of no use anyway. Although I had left the stretcher nearby at the edge of my shell hole, I had heard no sound of its breaking. There were plenty of other sounds to drown it out, of course, and some shells too near for the air to record. The vibration of one near one sent ripples through my nerves. Lacking a helper, I said to the wounded chap if he could get on my back I would carry him in. Nope, he could not do that. One leg was out of action. I then took both arms to drag him when he said, "Not that arm." His shoulder was shot up. So by his one good arm, I dragged him along and was making good progress when we came across an uninjured man who took one end of the stretcher, and we soon had him back into our trench. My stretcher-bearer mate Alex, I hardly need say, was a casualty, but I was not aware at what time he was wounded and found his way back to safety. Leaving the wounded man for others to dispose of, I took the stretcher and with a helper set out for another victim of the ill-fated raid. This I was able to repeat with the help of whoever I could get to accompany me. Thankfully no hesitation was shown by any to my request, but while spending a little time locating a wounded man, I'd lost my helper and had to return to find another. During the period of darkness, the German machine gun kept up a succession of traverse fire by swivelling the gun on a wide enough arc to cover the area. Immediately it opened up, we had to flatten out in the hope that the bullets would not drop to our level. On one such exercise, as flat as I knew how, with side of my head on ground, I thoughtlessly had not flattened my feet, and a bullet went through the back of the boot at the heel. The leg went temporarily out of control and flailed about in the air. The putty on that leg I found was ripped about, I guess, by other bullets at the same time. On one excursion, I had Archie MacArthur with me. He had not been in the open under fire before this, and I impressed upon him the need to flatten out with the first bark of the machine gun. When the inevitable occurred, he went down, but with palms of his hands on the ground and arms upright. 3 neat little bullet holes close together through his forearm gave him the same needed lesson the bullet in and out of my boot gave me. Now just think about the situation. You're running along, and when the machine gun opens up, you fall flat on your front. But you're also thinking about when you're going to get up to go running again. So you just imagine if you're doing that, you're going to put your palms flat on the ground and your elbows are going to poke up because you're going to be ready to jump up and get running once the machine gun is finished. But as you can see here, the path of the bullets was so low, even that little extra height of your elbows poking up into the air was enough to get hit by those machine gun bullets. Now, I always like to corroborate these stories, and I thought, let's see if I can find the military file of this Archie MacArthur. And I did manage to find it, service number 8/433. And it was definitely him because it noted that he was admitted to the casualty clearing station the next day, July 14th, with wounds to his forearm, gunshot wounds to his forearm. So that actually, completely matched the story told by the stretcher bearer. And then let's carry on with Aitken's account. Private S, censored, but I'll tell you the name is Starkey. Private Starkey, a more or less permanent inmate of the clink, not from moral faults, but from a congenital recalcitrant to discipline, had asked to be given some remission of punishment by taking part in the raid. He was wounded, but went back over the parapet at least a dozen times, bringing in a wounded man each time, and at dawn had to be restrained by main force, a hot-tempered and impulsive man, from going out again. His sentence was remitted. A decoration in the circumstances would hardly have been appropriate, but he received mention in division orders. He was actually put in for a Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal, but again, given that he was being forgiven prison time for being willing to take part in the trench raid, you can see why they didn't want to give him a medal. And if you look at his complexion in the photo, you would imagine that he was a New Zealand Maori, but he actually has a much more interesting backstory. It was said that one of his parents was a Native American and his other parent was Spanish, and his father had come to New Zealand as part of the gold rush coming out from the United States. Now, who is he? He's James Douglas Stark. Now, all the later accounts always call him James, but when I found his military file, which took a bit of digging because there was no military file for a James Douglas Stark, his military file only calls him Douglas Stark. Now, we know most about him except these brief references in these other books, from a book called Passport to Hell, written by a female journalist, Robin Hyde. And she encountered him at Mount Eden Prison in Auckland and found his story fascinating and decided to write it up. She actually wrote another one about his experiences after he got back to New Zealand. And sad to say, he had a fairly sad life because he was one of these guys who was a super soldier in combat, but just couldn't really manage to get by in peacetime, or frankly even peacetime within the army. So it's rather hard to know what we should call this book. Should we call it a war memoir? Should we call it a work of history? Should we call it a novel? I'm not really sure that any of these names attach to it. It's certainly based on the truth, but it may contain exaggerations. But at the same time, we have enough from other sources to know that Starkey, that was his nickname, was there, and he was certainly going out a lot and recovering wounded men, so perhaps we can trust a fairly large portion of this account. Oh, and Mount Eden Prison, I always found that a very strange place for a prison because it's very close to downtown Auckland, absolutely prime expensive real estate. When I used to go from my home to university as an undergraduate student, I used to go past Mount Eden Prison on the bus every day. And in fact, that building on the hill behind it, that's part of Auckland Boys Grammar, a rather elite boys' school in Auckland City. So it's quite interesting to have a prison right there, almost in the heart of the city. Now, to confirm it from his military file that he was offered remittance of a prison sentence, well, his military file definitely shows this to be true. So the location of all this is Armentières, and it says, sentence to penal servitude for 5 years. Why? Number 1, creating a disturbance in billets. 2, offering violence to his superior officer. I believe that involved when he was drunk on absinthe. He tried to murder a sergeant by opening fire through a toilet door with a revolver or something along those lines. Number 3, using treacherous words regarding the sovereign and army. I believe he basically said the king and the army could all go to hell, or words to that effect. The army commander suspends the sentence and directs that it be reconsidered in 1 month's time. In other words, he's going to be potentially allowed out if he performs. And then sure enough, the next entry, above sentence remitted for gallantry performed on the 13th of July 1916 in the field. So absolutely confirmed that he got out of 5 years penal servitude. That means prison with hard labour for his bravery on that day. And, well, let's read some of it. The next wounded man was little Jimmy Peters, whose ghastly wound had shorn down from left shoulder to waist. The next one he found was another Dunedin boy, Alex Pale. His shoulder was blown off, exposing the mass of the lung. He said, "Curtains for me, Starkey." Starkey offered him a cigarette, lit it, and put it in his mouth. He couldn't hold it between his lips, but said gently, quietly, "Stay with me." Then he said, "Tell Mum," and died. Norman White was next, with both legs smashed, in too much pain to bite back the cries from his throat. "Take me away from this! Take me away from this!" But before they got to the trenches, he was dead. Starkey lowered his body down into the trench. There were others, but he didn't know their names. Only a dreadful weariness and blood clotting in mouth, nostrils and ears, as the shell concussion tore in two the delicate fibres of little blood vessels. When he got back to the trenches in early morning, he asked for Jackie Mackenzie. Jackie Mackenzie was this young man that his squad had adopted as sort of a little mascot or pet, and they were terribly anxious to make sure he did not go on the raid, but he snuck out anyway. Nobody had seen him. Then Starkey went mad. He ran up and down the trenches shouting, tearing in and out of empty dugouts. Starkey went on no man's land again, this time out to get even. A German machine gun was still getting the wounded as they crawled towards the trenches. Starkey crawled on his stomach through mud and wire until he lay above the gun. Then he drew the pin of the Mills bomb, pressing his hand down into the mud so that it wouldn't explode too soon. Very gently he rolled the bomb down into the machine gun nest. There were 5 men there. He had just a glimpse of startled white faces when the bomb turned the place into a spouting fountain of earth and flesh. He wasn't sure about the gun. He dragged it over to the British wires and left it there. Again he hunted among the wounded, turning over bodies that lay awkwardly face downward in the mud. Then among the corpses, looking up at the sky, was Jackie. Starkey carried the boy back to the trenches and laid him down very carefully, not in the Red Cross dressing station, but in his own dugout. Then he ran out of the dugout and blundered across no man's land. And there was just one other thing I found it rather interesting in Starkey's military file. It was the fact that one of his children had written to the War Office requesting information. Specifically, she didn't know if her father had been at Gallipoli and wanted to know. And she got a very nice reply from this guy Mackenzie, writing for the Deputy Secretary of Defence. And he wrote, "The records which have been retained by the Army for individual service in World War I and are now very meagre and relate only to essential details. Although I am aware of your father's colourful war service, there is very little specific information left in official records of his exploits." Now, that brings us back full circle to my grandfather's story. There is his wound stripe, and his military file makes it clear that he got that wound stripe because he was badly injured in the shoulder the same day that all of this was going on. So what do we know? We know that he was in a non-combat unit. He was with the Army Service Corps, and he was working with the field bakery at Armentières. So he was in the right general area. And what else do we know? We know gunshot wound right shoulder, and we know it was serious enough to take him out of combat for over a year. We know that he was admitted to number 2 CCS that was at Bailleul, just a little bit further behind the lines up the road from Armentières, on July the 14th, 1916. Now, when we compare that record that I looked up of Archie MacArthur, he was the guy who went out helping with the stretcher bearers, who got shot through the forearm. Well, it has him being admitted to the same casualty clearing station and on July the 14th, 1916. So certainly most people being wounded in this disaster were being sent back to Bailleul. It doesn't prove that my grandfather was mixed up in it, but he may well have been. Now, there's numerous comments that anyone available was being sent out to help recover the wounded, particularly the stretcher bearer's account, but also some of the other officers, anybody who was there. So I can't help wondering if my grandfather was up there maybe delivering food to the men, and he was just willing to go out and do something. And perhaps that was what was going on. And I can't help imagining that same story of the guys getting shot by the machine gun as they were out there recovering, and thinking that, again, maybe if my grandfather was low to the ground, a bullet coming in at that angle as you're lying down, hitting you in the shoulder, would do a terrible lot of damage. And that would certainly correspond to the seriousness of his wound. And there's also the comment, and the natural, given what was going on, that most of the German artillery would not have been shooting behind the lines on this occasion. It was shooting deliberately at no man's land. It doesn't mean there couldn't have been shots falling further back. But, German artillery would always shell the town of Armentières and other things, so there were plenty of casualties. You didn't have to be out in the front line. He didn't have to be there rescuing wounded. But at the same time, on this particular occasion, German artillery was particularly concentrated right there, even in front of the front line. And that reduces the possibility that he could have been wounded in some other location. Because, as I said, they were shelling towns, and this is a photo I found from the New Zealand National Army Museum, in fact, of German artillery hitting buildings behind the line. Now, just the final end note to this story. So my grandfather was badly wounded in mid-July, possibly during this disastrous trench raid or the recovery operations. Now, in August, a month later, the New Zealand division was withdrawn from Armentières. You can see on the map right at the top there's Armentières, because they were needed in the Battle of the Somme, and in September they were redeployed to the Somme. So in one sense, I can't help feeling that maybe my grandfather was lucky to receive that wound. I'm sure he didn't think so at the time, but it meant he was not there for the disastrous, casualty-heavy bloodbath that was the Somme. He got sent back to England. And as I said, it took more than a year for him to recover. And when he returned to the front, this time with a combat unit, the New Zealand machine gunners, he arrived in October, just after the New Zealanders had completed fighting in the Battle of Passchendaele. Now, Passchendaele for the New Zealanders was even worse than the Somme. New Zealanders suffered more casualties there than they did in 1916. So this brutal shoulder wound kept him out of the Somme and kept him out of Passchendaele. And in a previous episode, I've already talked about how his service with the horses meant he sailed up and looked at the beaches of Gallipoli in the middle of a battle, but never landed and was sent back to Egypt. So 3 times, perhaps just by the skin of his teeth, he avoided being present in 3 brutal bloodbaths. And I can't help wondering if that's the only reason why I'm still here today. And that is where I'm going to conclude it for today. So I'm going to say good evening to you.